So as we're just sitting here, we can notice that we're breathing. As we mentioned last time, it's helpful to breathe through the nose if possible. And without trying to breathe in any particular way, just notice that the breath is happening by itself. The body knows how to do it. So we don't need to be in the controller's role. We don't need to be the manager of our breath. We can just stand back and notice that it knows what it's doing. We don't need to interfere. We can just notice it, notice the sensation of it in the body. You can also notice the sensation of the body sitting in the chair or on the cushion. Just that simple sense of touch, sense of being supported. Chair is being entirely itself. It doesn't project an attitude or about how we're sitting in it. We're just supported by it. And still the breath is happening. And we might notice that thoughts are happening too, but we can just see those as another arising within our awareness. Usually of no more significance than the sense of sitting in the chair. At least for this time, we can just allow whatever thoughts to arise to just let them be, much like the breath. We allow them to be there without taking a position for or against, without trying to improve them, without trying to make them go away. They can just be the next sensation that we're experiencing. So here we are, just sitting, breathing, being present in the room. Maybe noticing a thought or two drifting by. All of which are happening without our need to control any of it. We can just sit back and watch the show. And as we do that, we can become more curious about what it is that's actually noticing all of those arisings. The presence in the room, the breath coming and going, sense of sitting, thoughts, all of those could be considered arisings within consciousness. And we can just step back and redirect our attention away from the objects of consciousness back to the consciousness itself. Just that simple everyday consciousness. Consciousness that exists prior to whatever content may arise within it. We can notice that we didn't conjure up that consciousness. We didn't attain it. We're certainly not the manager of it. We can just notice that when we just step back just a little bit from the content, we notice consciousness is present. Consciousness is always present, but often our attention is drawn out into the content rather than remaining sort of quietly watching from the perspective of awareness, consciousness. So we can just let our attention come back to the consciousness itself. Thoughts may still be there, feelings may still be there, not a problem. They can pull our energy away if we're trying to change them or improve them. But if we just let them be, they'll gradually diminish in insisting that our attention be pulled there. So then we can just rest in this simple awareness. And we may notice that it is of a fundamentally different character than, well, everything else. It's different in that it's not an object. It's not a thing that we can stand back from and look at, right? We can't stand back and look at it because it is itself what's looking. So it's not an object like a noun, even though a word like consciousness sounds like a noun. But it's actually just looking, not looking with our eyes or hearing with our ears or sensing with our body, but that which is aware of all of that. So it's not an object. Because it's not an object, we can't, we really need to avoid conceptualizing about it. That's not actually that helpful, because any concept about it will not be true. What's true is the direct sensing from that. We can be conscious, we are conscious. That consciousness, that awareness is already present in everyone fully. And so there's a possibility to just recognize the uniqueness of that, the primacy of that, the fundamental nature of that. We can appreciate it when we see that without consciousness, without awareness, there would be no, the body might still be there, we may still function as a in a robot-like fashion, but there'd be nothing that was aware of whatever was happening, whatever we were doing. We could still go on in a conditioned kind of way, but there would be no awareness of that. So that awareness is of a fundamentally different, it's a different order of being than everything else. Our day-to-day experiences, our body, our thoughts, all are objects within this awareness. So when we really look at that, it's possible to appreciate it, become more curious about it, become more in awe of it, of just the amazing capacity that we all have to be aware of being alive, aware of this moment. Even when our attention is pulled away into whatever we may be doing, we're still conscious, we're still aware of that even though our attention may be elsewhere, when we can see that, when we can see that that awareness is present, when we rest fully in it, it's also present when we're pulled into the doing of the moment. Awareness actually doesn't have a problem with that either way. The mind might prefer spaciousness, awareness, rather than getting pulled into thought. But awareness itself doesn't have a problem with wherever this body-mind goes. It will be there through thick and thin, good times and bad. It'll still be present. Okay, so it's helpful just to take note of this simple awareness, simple but extraordinary awareness, and come back to it often. Just whenever we have a moment during the day that we might otherwise choose to lapse into boredom or distraction or something to pull us away into things that aren't that essential. Anytime we find ourselves in that space, we can just say, oh, okay, let me just step back for a moment and see if even in this moment of boredom or restlessness, I wonder if this awareness is still present now. I'll just check in. And we may be surprised to find out, yes, even now that awareness is there. And as we do that often, out of, you could say, devotion, we begin to recognize that that awareness is actually never absent. It is more loyal than any dog that we ever had, any lover that we ever had. Because it is our truest self. I don't say that as something to be believed. I'm saying it as a suggestion to be curious about, wonder about. I wonder if that's actually true. I wonder if I am fundamentally this awareness. I wonder if that's possible. It's not what we heard growing up. But I wonder if that's possible. And we can just leave it as an open question. It's actually not helpful to try to answer that question conceptually, like, okay, which belief am I in favor of? Or which belief feels more real to me in this moment based on everything I've thought about and read about before? That's actually not helpful. It's much more helpful just to leave it as an open question, like, I wonder if that's actually true. And it may just remain an open question for quite some time, perhaps even years. But that unknowing is something that will help dissolve some of the rigidity in our way of thinking and open up the possibility of seeing something from a different perspective. Again, not as a concept, but just as a direct seeing, where we become more and more unable to insist that what we are is limited to this body, these thoughts. my story. And by just stepping back into this awareness, it allows that openness, because that awareness isn't insisting on, it's actually not insisting on attaining anything, largely because we can't imagine what it is that enlightenment will look like until it's actually seen for ourselves. And then there's no doubt. Up until that time, there can be faith, there can be belief, might be helpful. More helpful just to hold it as a possibility. Like, I wonder if that's actually possible. If it is, it's worth pursuing wholeheartedly. That has value. And at first glance, this awareness or consciousness may not seem like much. It may seem like, oh, okay, that's sort of a nice philosophical distinction between the content of awareness and awareness itself. But it's much, much more than that. That may be how it's first seen, sort of in a conceptual kind of way. But don't take that as a final revelation. Right? Allow that possibility to really, really work on you as a possibility. Like, I wonder what that really is. I mean, lots of traditions talk about it. You know, maybe there's something to it. Maybe it's worth spending time there to find out what is actually living this life. Adyashanti tells a story of, he had been meditating for, I don't know, several years, maybe 3 or 4 years at that point, like seriously meditating, like 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day. And one day he had the thought, you know, I've been meditating all this time and it feels frustrating. I can't really, you know, I haven't had the big breakthrough. And I wonder what it is that's actually trying to meditate. You know, it would seem like a question you could ask, you know, the first time you sat down, but most of us don't. Most of us just say, oh, okay, well, I guess that's what I should do. It's a good idea. I've heard it is. But to ask the question, who is it that's meditating, changes the whole game, because suddenly we're not looking outside of ourselves for the experience. We've turned it around and inquired what it is here within that is doing this, living this life, having this experience, noticing this thought, eating this cereal. Who is that? Changes the whole direction. Okay. Everybody good? What I thought we could talk about tonight is spiritual transmission. So this term transmission comes from Zen, the Zen Buddhism. And the basic phrase is transmission beyond words in scripture, right? Something that appears to be conveyed from a teacher to a student, let's say, at a certain point. That's how it's usually interpreted. So I thought it was worthwhile to go back and just very briefly go over about a few thousand years of how that evolved. We'll take some giant steps there, so I won't get too detailed. But there's a story of Buddha with a large gathering, large, like perhaps 1,000 or more monks. And he comes into the gathering and holds up a flower, twirls it around in his hand, but doesn't say anything. And out of the gathering of 1,000 monks, there was one monk, his name was Mahakashapa, and he alone smiled wholeheartedly in recognition of the teaching. The teaching was this flower and silence. And the Buddha immediately recognized Mahakashapa and made a statement where he entrusted the nirvana of the mind to Mahakashapa. He announced it right then and there, out of the thousands of people. A lot of people were surprised by that because the Mahakashapa apparently wasn't, one of the most acknowledged monks there. And yet he was given this recognition out of thousands based on a smile. Okay. Transmission beyond words and scripture. Okay. What's interesting, I find it interesting anyway, about the story is that this Mahakashapa, after Buddha's death, was actually the one that sort of held this newly evolving sect together, conveyed the first Buddhist council, sort of agreed on a set of basic principles that the Buddha talked about. And what I find interesting about that is that the person who, is the first example within this tradition of awakening beyond words and scripture was the one responsible for creating a set of scriptures, not single-handedly, but he convened the council to create a set of scriptures that formed the basis for Buddhism. And over the next 1,000 years, the scriptures began to take on more and more authority as they were interpreted and refined and, just analyzed in greater and greater detail. And the path of direct transmission sort of lost favor over those almost 1,000 years of Buddhism. And it was really when a Buddhist monk from India traveled to China. His name was Bodhidharma, and who sort of revived the practice. And he has a very short 4-line poem that I'll have to read, but it's the essence of this sense of transmission beyond words and scripture. Okay, so here's Bodhidharma arriving in China, and his poem reads, "A special transmission outside scripture, not founded upon words and letters." Okay, so we're talking about something that's not conceptual here. And the rest of the poem is, "By pointing directly to one's mind, it lets one see into one's own true nature and thus attain Buddhahood." Okay, what's interesting about this that I find is that the way that we normally think of transmission is that it's like a conveyance. It goes from A to B, and in spiritual, like sort of like an electrical transmission line. It moves power from the main station to your house. Or in spirituality, it's often thought of as the teacher has some knowledge, some ability, some wisdom that is conveyed at some moment to another person. But the second half of the poem, it goes in a different direction. It says, by pointing directly to one's mind. Okay, so it's saying that the teacher is pointing to something. He's not doing it to the person. You know, he's not conveying something that he has that the other person doesn't. He's pointing to the other person's mind. That's where to look. And the last line is, it lets one see into one's own true nature and thus attain Buddhahood. So again, it's not the teacher doing it, it lets one see into one's own true nature. So you're the one still doing the seeing, right? It's up to us to see it for ourselves. It's not something that the teacher, any teacher, can do to another person. You know, a teacher with certain skills can raise another person's energy level so that they may be more open, they may be receptive, they might have, you know, extraordinary experiences that can feel like awakening. But you know, if the other person isn't ready for that, it can be confusing or worse, right? And it's also not necessarily stable. So what's helpful is that there is a ripening period. So, I mean, we're all in a hurry, right? We want to get it done. But a ripening period, I'd suggest, is actually important. So this transmission, although we think of it as the final coup de grace, right? The final act of conveyance of some kind. But I mean, transmission is something that we're all doing all of the time, right? We're all our own experience, our own inner being. If you walk into a room of a, I don't know, person sort of wallowing in self-pity, it'll feel, I mean, you'll very quickly feel like sort of a murky kind of energy. You know, on the other hand, if you know, meet a friend, upbeat, genuinely happy, it's an uplifting experience, right? Also, if you've ever been fortunate enough to be with a person who is dying, knows that they're dying, and has completely accepted that themselves, to be in that person's presence is an immense grace. There's a sense of feeling honored just to be with a person who has relinquished themselves to the fullness of life. Okay, so we're all transmitting something all the time. We're transmitting our state of being, and we can feel it when we meet other people. So there's several paths that can be used in this direction to seek our awakening. I mean, one path is you know, finding a teacher that we are intuitively somehow drawn to, maybe respect, maybe trust, and try it out, right? And until we actually know what it is that we're looking for, which happens later on, we're just going on intuition, we're going on trust, we're going on faith. right? I don't mean by faith, I don't mean faith in a set of beliefs. I mean just faith, right? But it's, in some sense, it's actually quite scientific. It's what happens in science and scientific methodology. You know, one scientist does an experiment and he has a result that's never been reported before, publishes it in a scientific journal. Other scientists read it. Some scientists say, well, that's interesting and it might even be true. But I want to find out for myself. I want to confirm it for myself. And so I'll do the exact same experiment. You know, I'm intrigued enough that I'll do that experiment, spend my time and energy, and I'll do it as it was done and see if I get the same result. You know, maybe I will, maybe I won't. If we do get the same result, then it's no longer, we no longer understand that discovery just on a hearsay basis. We actually know we did the work ourselves. We found out, yeah, that's true. I did it. I'm satisfied that that person did an honorable experiment, discovered something new, and I know that too for myself. Not dependent on anybody, what anybody else says about it or not. I know that for myself. So in that way, working with a teacher is helpful. What's actually helpful about it is that a teacher can suggest an avenue to look. You know, you still have to do the looking yourself, but the teacher can suggest this avenue is fruitful, this avenue not so much. You know, you can spend a lot of years going down this path. You can do it if you want, but you know, if you're looking to gain this realization of enlightenment, this is the most expedient way to do it. So again, very similar. You know, we think, okay, that may be true, but I want to find out for myself. I'll look for myself. I'll look in the direction suggested. I'll do the practices. You know, I'll ask the questions maybe that are suggested, but I'll do it myself. So that's a valid way of looking, right? I just want to mention that in each of these paths, there's a possible downside. And the possible downside of working with a teacher is that we form the belief that the teacher has something special that we do not. You know, we put the teacher up on a pedestal, believe that they're special, and I'm not, of course, but they are, and therefore the best I can hope to do is worship their attainment. Okay, so just that sense of assigning the specialness to a teacher actually will go a long way to preventing us from actually seeing what a true teacher is trying to convey, and that is no one's special. You know, that awareness that we talked about earlier is fully functioning in all of us equally already. Okay, so that's one possibility. Of course, you know, there are more direct path teachers out there, and some paths may still get you there eventually, but are much not quite as direct, let's say. I mean, there's also teachers out there that are speaking from not their direct experience, but conceptualizations about what they've read, what they've heard. That's not so helpful. And the reason it's not so helpful is because what is, let's use the word transmitted, what's transmitted isn't actually a function of the word spoken. You know, two people can say the exact same sentence. If one person actually knows that that's true and the other person only believes that that's true, it will have totally different impacts. And we can also easily be, allow ourselves to be misled by teachers if our intention aren't sincere. I mean, there's charismatic people out there. Charisma doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Charisma might be charming, might be fun to be around. But if we're just seeking to be charmed, there will be snake charmers out there. Okay, so that's you know, working with a teacher. Another totally viable path is choosing not to work with teachers at all. You know, just going it alone. I'm going to devote myself to the direct experience of life itself and enjoy it fully, participate in it fully, but keep my eyes open. You know, try to understand life at the deepest possible level, using my experiences, day-to-day experiences out in the world, not even necessarily spiritual. You know, this path, we're basically using life itself as the teacher. This is possible also. It's possible only if we fully give ourselves to life. We accept the teachings of life, you know, that we don't approach it as, well, I know what's true, you know, life got it right this time, wrong that time, I agree with this, but not that. To go down that path using life as a teacher, it really means being surrendered to life. Doesn't mean that we don't take responsibilities, but it does mean that we have to take life at face value as a teaching, totally. You know, this is very much in the vein of allowing everything to be as it is, basically because that's the way it is. We're not actually allowing it. It will be as it is in any event, but it's an acknowledgement that I'm willing to acknowledge life as it shows up, as a teaching, and then life itself becomes a teacher. Again, this path also has a downside in that there's lots of things to do out in life. We can get lost in all the wondrous experiences and wanting more, better. So each of these paths has advantages, also has some risks as well. All right, third and last path is that, you know, I'm not going to look out in the world. I'm not going to depend on a teacher. I'm just going to look within. I've heard that the truth that's present here, once seen, can be seen everywhere. I don't know that for a fact, but you know, I also wouldn't know if life itself is a valid teacher, and I don't know if a certain teacher is a valid teacher. I just have to take my best shot and go down that road wholeheartedly. So in this case, we're saying I'm going to choose to not look outside of myself, not look to or be dependent on a teacher, but to wholeheartedly, courageously, vigorously look within. So this is a valid path also, right? But it has to be ruthless. I mean, it has to look through every way we're defining ourselves, every way we're holding on to an identity and going beyond that. You know, this is in Indian tradition, there's a term, it's called neti neti. It just means not this, not this. It's a denial of every possible way that we define ourselves, not just in a rote kind of way, but really seeing that what I am isn't my thoughts, what I am isn't my feelings, what I am isn't my body, but really, really seeing it, not just as a mindless mantra. So that this path also works, but it's sort of depends on our self-courage and determination. And the risk here is that we get lost in our conceptualizations about awakening rather than seeing our way through the obstacles to the actual realization itself. So this is the difference between philosophy about awakening and awakening. Okay, so how does, coming back to transmission, how does transmission play in all of these cases? You know, in what sense is anything transmitted from one to another, or does this transmission really mean something else? So I'd suggest that the transmission isn't, let's say the teacher, but it could be life, or it could be your inner guru, higher self, however you want to think about it. It's not like they are holding on to some knowledge that they're waiting to dispense to you. It's not that. It's really, let's say, a teacher is just being herself, right? Being fully herself. But there's something in that. There's some flavor there that's beyond even the words that are spoken. There's some flavor there that may spark a resonance within us, like sort of like a smell might wake up an old memory, thinking, oh yeah, I remember. I had forgotten, but now I see it, I remember. So there can be a resonance. It's similar in a very generalized way of, if you had a guitar over here, you pluck a string, and then another guitar is over here, that same note, that same string will begin to vibrate. Now, as long as we see that sort of metaphorically, it's not an energetic conveyance, right? This is something beyond an energy. It's beyond ideas, it's beyond experience, it's beyond energy. It is being, let's just say beingness itself. But the beingness that's recognized here is already fully present here, just not recognized. So it's something like just something that stirs us awake. So there's not something that goes from A to B. There's something that exists here that's actually undifferentiated from what exists over here, but it just is sufficiently clear, let's say, to cause a stirring, an awakening over here, awakening out of a slumber caused by some dusty ideas and beliefs and about who we are, what we believe, etc. So it's much more like that. So in Zen, there's there's been this centuries-long debate. Oh, I wanted to tell one story first. This is, I'm not sure when it happened or the name of the monk, but I remember the story. So the story is there's going to be a huge sort of nationwide gathering in China, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, let's say. And all the monks in Bodhidharma's tradition, which in China is called Chan, C-H-A-N, Chan Buddhism. Monks in this tradition were being called together, and many back in those days, people traveled by foot, so people traveled, days, weeks to get to this get together, this gathering. And one of the big draws was going to be the certain monk. I mean, in today's terms, they would be the keynote speaker. And this person traveled a long way too to come to this event. So finally, the big day came. They had the conference, and they had other speakers. And then finally, at the end of the day, this one monk came up to the stage, and everybody was hushed and just waiting for what this renowned monk was going to present. And he got up on the stage. He had this big walking staff, and he got up on the stage and pounded his staff on the ground 3 times. Didn't say a thing, walked off the stage and went home. Right? So you can sort of imagine, people in the audience, what they were saying to themselves, like, I don't know, what a ripoff, I walked all this way, and, this is what I got, Can't believe it. Somebody else might have been saying, well, I wonder what they were trying to communicate, what concept, trying to figure it out mentally. Okay. Maybe there's some other guy there saying, wow, man, that was so Zen. Of course, Zen didn't exist then yet. That came 100 years or so later in Japan. But that, again, is this transmission beyond words and scripture. So it was the utter reality of that sound, that gesture, without words and scripture, as more real than anything else that was spoken that day. Right? So in Zen, one of the controversies that have been going on for centuries is, whether awakening is gradual or sudden. There are actually 2 whole distinct sects of Zen just based on that one distinction. So the question, is the awakening gradual or is it sudden? Because it has to do with this idea of transmission. If the transmission is at a moment in time that finally something is conveyed and that one gesture creates the awakening, it's a little different than the transmission was always happening. And maybe at a single moment, whatever that condition was sufficient to finally cause that recognition. But I see it as, so in some ways, sort of a pointless argument. It's like saying, let's take a peach tree. The peach on the tree takes a long time to ripen. But there's one moment that comes when the peach suddenly falls to the ground and it's ripe, fully ripe. So which was it? Was the peach suddenly or gradually ripe? So this movement, this transmission is something that is available. It's not like the teacher is holding anything back. Teachers just being themselves. They may be talking, they may not be, they may be telling stories, they may be talking about whatever. They may be pointing directly. All the while, there's something that can be noticed. If a person is paying attention, not so much paying attention to the words that are spoken, but more so paying attention to where the words are spoken from. You know, intuiting the perspective that what's being said is spoken from, much more important than the words itself. So in that sense, the listening is not, it doesn't have anything to do with agreeing or disagreeing or, you know, comparing it to some other teaching. All of that's just mental activity. You know, what we're talking about here is something beyond words. It's something beyond the mental activity of the mind. So teacher, I mean, is always talking beyond to another person, beyond their mental concepts. You know, it may sound like we're talking about concepts, but what's really happening is that you know, a teacher just is communicating something without even attempting to communicate anything that may be recognized by another person as their essential nature. So there's nothing transferred, it's a recognition, you know, it's sort of recognizing that fragrance maybe. Something beyond mental concepts. So it's not a conveyance of an idea, it's not a conveyance of an experience or energy. I mean, there are Indian gurus that are really good at conveying energy. You know, the Indian term for that, Shakti, it's actually, you know, can feel like a shock almost. But there's like late night Christian preachers that are really good at it too. They can, you know, touch you on your forehead and you can, you know, fall into an ecstatic swoon. Energy can be transferred. It's not what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is not a conveyance of energy. It's not a conveyance of an experience. It is much more like a resonance. Because what wakes up is a recognition of oneself as being that already. The awakening isn't attaining something that, let's say, a teacher has and you don't. That's a false idea. And there are notable historic figures in, you know, across the religious traditions that say exactly the same thing in almost very similar words. You know, Christian, Sufi, Advaita, Zen, very, very similar wording. You know, that you are what you seek. You are already what you are seeking. The recognition is when you find that out. You know, so it's not a conveyance of energy. It's not a particular experience. It is discovering what you are already, always have been. Couldn't be anything else. What we wake up from is the belief in being a separate person. That's what we wake up from. You know, the person, the separate person, the ego, is not what wakes up. That's what we wake up from, that illusion. That belief in a separate self is what we wake up from. Now, it should be clear that when awakening happens, it's an empowering, there's a sense of empowerment. So this is another reason that I said that this ripening period actually is important, because it's useful to have heard, I don't know, maybe 100 times that the awakening does not make us special. It does not elevate us above the rest of humanity. It allows us to recognize that we are actually not other than the rest of humanity. So by hearing that over and over again, before awakening, it's helpful that to see when our ego tries to come back in and claim the awakeness for itself. That can happen. It does happen. And that happens when an ego claims enlightenment for itself, and believe that me as a separate person is awake. Not only false, but dangerous. An awakened, well, there's no such thing as an awakened ego, but an ego who thinks that they're awake is dangerous. Because they may have actually seen something, but then they claim it for themselves as a separate individual, apart and above the rest of humanity. Therefore, anything that they think is true, this is dangerous. Okay, so this period of ripening is actually useful. It's a period when we understand sort of basic teachings. You know, I've talked before about compassion, and there's sort of practiced compassion, and then there's sort of true effortless compassion. The practiced compassion is useful because it makes us aware at the time of enlightenment that that's the direction to go into, rather than claiming it for oneself. It's really as a gift that then can be given to others. So that's the usefulness of it. There are also probably nicer people along the way.